That night, a retired nurse living alone in the snowy mountains thought all she had left were the wind and the ticking of her old clock. But when the cabin door blew open in the whiteout, her white house cat didn't come home alone. He was dragging a tiny, blood-streaked bundle, almost frozen solid, a lost Bobcat kitten. From the moment her shaking hands pressed over that weak little chest, the life she believed was quietly winding down began to open in a way no one would have believed. How could a 64-year-old woman, a house cat, and a wild bobcat end up so tied to one another that years later, that same wild creature would come pounding back through a blizzard, howling for an ambulance that saved her life? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The first winter after I retired was the quietest my ears had ever known. For 40 years, my nights were stitched together by sirens and radio chatter, the harsh beeping of monitors, the sharp hiss of oxygen. Now, when the sun slipped behind the ridge, all I heard was wind dragging its fingers along the cabin walls and the soft tick of cooling metal from the old wood stove. Lumen's paws made the only familiar sound in that silence. A gentle thump as he jumped from the arm of the chair, a whisper of fur against my jeans when he brushed past my legs. Under the lamplight, his coat looked almost unreal, a wide white river spilling down his sides, every hair catching the gold like fresh snow under a street lamp. When he blinked at me, his pale green eyes looked almost human, as if he was checking to see if I was still there. "I'm fine," I told him, even when I didn't feel fine at all. Outside, Silver Ridge was already wrapped in snow. The pines on the slope behind the cabin wore heavy white sleeves, branches sagging. The sky had that flat gray color that always made me think of the hospital ceilings at 3 in the morning. The weather report on the little radio in the kitchen said a bigger storm was rolling in from the west, the kind that shut the highway down and made the town disappear behind a curtain of white. I moved slow now, the way people do when there's no backup crew coming through the door. No EMTs shouting vitals as they wheel a stretcher in. My knees complained when I stood too long at the sink. My hands ached in the cold, even with the fire going. On nights like this, I made tea more for the warmth of the mug than for the taste. On the shelf by the front window sat a framed photograph of my husband, Tom, taken long before his heart gave out. He was laughing at something off camera, head tilted back, crow's feet folded deep at the corners of his eyes. The glass caught the reflection of the flames, so it always looked like there was a tiny fire dancing in his smile. I lit a single taper candle in front of the photo, the way I always did when the first big storm of winter was coming. The match flared sulfur yellow, the wick caught, and a thin column of honey-colored light rose up between me and the glass. I told myself Itia was just a ritual, something to mark the season. The truth was, it felt like saying a small, stubborn no to the dark that pressed in at the windows. My phone buzzed on the table, screen glowing blue in the dim room. Clara's name popped up, an old paramedic partner, now stuck down in Denver traffic instead of mountain snow. "You sound tired," she said the moment I answered. "I'm retired," I told her. "It's a different kind of tired." We talked about nothing and everything, the hospital gossip, who had finally quit nights, which doctor had run off with which nurse. I laughed in all the right places, but my voice echoed strangely in my own ears like it didn't belong in this quiet little house. "Are you lonely up there?" Clara asked, softer now. I looked at Lumen stretched out on the rug, his tail flicking lazily, the fire painting his fur with a faint orange wash. "I've got company," I said. "He's a better listener than half our patients ever were." "Ellen," she pressed, "I mean really lonely." I swallowed. The candle flickered, casting Tom's face into a momentary blur. "I'm learning how to be alone without feeling left behind," I said finally. "Some nights, I do better than others." We skirted around the subject of my heart. The medication lined up on the counter in their orange bottles, the episode last spring I still called a little scare, even though Clara had seen the chart. We didn't talk about the other thing either. The one fear I didn't say aloud, the one that waited for me at 3 in the morning when even the wind went quiet. I worry more about what happens if Lumen goes before I do, I admitted, surprising myself. Then it's just me and the echoes up here. On the floor, his ears twitched, as if he'd heard his name through the static of our conversation. "You're tougher than you think," Clara said, "but maybe it wouldn't hurt to come down to town a little more. Silver Ridge is small, but it's not empty." We said goodnight, promised coffee soon. The way retired people always do. The phone went dark, and the cabin grew smaller around the circle of lamplight. Lumen yawned, jaws opening wide, pink tongue curling, then rose and padded to the door, tail high like a white banner. "You're not going far," I told him, reaching for my coat. "Storm's close." He looked up at me with that patient, ancient expression cats have, as if humoring a child. When I opened the door, a blade of cold air slid across the floor, and snowflakes whirled in like tiny, icy moths. The sky outside had deepened to a heavy charcoal, the first real fingers of the storm dragging across the ridge. Lumen stepped out onto the porch, his paws making soft, perfect prints in the fresh powder. For a moment he stood there, scenting the air, fur rippling in the wind, then slipped off the edge of the light into the dark between the pines. "Don't stay long," called after him. The door closed on the storm, leaving me in the muffled hush of the cabin. The clock in the kitchen ticked. The wood in the stove shifted with a low groan. I poured myself another cup of tea and tried to read, but my eyes kept sliding to the door, listening for the scrape of claws on the step, the familiar thump of his body against the wood. An hour passed, then 2. The snow on the porch swallowed his tracks. The wind grew louder, a low, continuous roar that shook the window panes. I moved the candle closer to the door, as if that thin, trembling flame could guide him home. By midnight, the only sound in the cabin was my own heart, beating too loudly in the quiet, and the unanswered question in my chest: what if, this time, he didn't come back? The storm finally drowned out my thoughts. Wind shoved at the cabin from every side, making the walls give a low, tired sigh. Snow hit the windows in hard little bursts, like someone tossing handfuls of sand. Every few minutes, I checked the clock, then the door, then the empty spot on the rug where Lumen usually slept, his fur glowing softly in the firelight. When the knock came, it wasn't really a knock at all. It was a dull, muffled thud, followed by the slow drag of something heavy across the porch boards. For a second, I thought it was just a log rolling in the woodpile, or a branch the wind had torn loose. Then I heard it again. Thump, scrape, a faint, hoarse sound, like air pushed through a broken whistle. I was on my feet before my mind caught up. The candle flame jumped when I passed, making Tom's picture flicker as if he'd turned his head to look toward the door too. My fingers felt thick and clumsy on the deadbolt, the metal icy against the thin skin of my knuckles. When the door swung open, the cold slapped me full in the face, sharp and wet, tasting like copper and pine. Snow swirled in, sparkling in the lamplight. And there, framed in that wild white blur, stood Lumen. For a moment I could only stare. His fur, usually pure and clean as fresh linen, was soaked and tangled, clumped into grayish ropes. Ice crystals glittered along his whiskers. His ears were flattened, and his chest rose and fell in quick, shallow pulls. He wasn't alone. Clamped in his jaws, just behind the head, he held a small, limp bundle of spotted fur. It hung crookedly, one front leg dragging along the porch, leaving a thin, dark streak on the wood that the blowing snow couldn't quite erase fast enough. "Lumen," I whispered, my voice barely more than the wind itself. "Oh my God, what have you done?" He stepped forward, muscles bunching under the matted coat, and crossed the threshold as if the weight between his teeth was nothing. I shut the door behind him, and the howl of the storm dropped to a low, distant roar. The sudden quiet made my heart pound even louder in my ears. He laid the bundle gently on the rug near the stove and stepped back, sides heaving. Up close, the smell hit. Me, a mix of wet fur, blood, and that sharp, wild musk that doesn't belong to house cats or couch cushions or clean laundry. It was the smell of something that belonged out there in the dark tree line, not on an old woman's floor. I knelt, my knees protesting as they met the wooden planks. The little body was shockingly light when I slid my hands under it, bones sharp under loose skin. Spots and faint stripes patterned the coat, not like any tabby I'd ever seen. Tufts of fur stood up on the ears like tiny flames. "Well, I'll be damned," I breathed. "You brought me a bobcat." Its fur was cold, almost waxy under my fingers. I pressed 2 fingers to the thin chest, to the side of the neck, hunting for a pulse the way my hands had done 1,000 times before. There it was, a faint, irregular flutter like a moth trapped against glass. "Hang on, sweetheart," I muttered, more to myself than to the animal. "You're not gone yet." Lumen moved closer, his huge white body a silent presence at my shoulder. He made a small sound in his throat, not quite a meow, not quite a growl, more like a question. His eyes were wide and bright, fixed not on me, but on the tiny creature in my hands. As I shifted my grip, the front leg that had been dragging slid free of the fur and came into the light. That was when I saw it clearly, a raw, angry groove all the way around the limb, skin broken, fur matted with dried, rust-colored blood. The flesh was swollen above the cut, the edges ragged in a way I knew too well. Not a bite, not a fall, a trap. My stomach tightened, a cold knot under my ribs. I'd seen wounds like that on too many dogs people dragged into the ER because they couldn't afford a vet. Steel cable or rusted teeth of a snare, cinched tight, waiting all night for whatever unlucky thing had stepped wrong. I glanced toward the window where the storm pressed its gray face against the glass. My cabin felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had crept in closer. Somewhere out there in the darkness, not far from my front porch, someone had set a trap meant to maim and hold, and this tiny wild thing had paid the price. My house cat had dragged home a tiny bobcat kitten from a blizzard and a snare. And as I cradled that trembling, spotted body in my palms, I had the bone-deep feeling that the quiet life I'd been trying to settle into had just been split clean open. Old habits took over before panic had a chance to. I slid the little body onto a faded bath towel, the kind I'd kept long past its prime for muddy paws and messy projects, and carried it to the patch of floor right in front of the stove. The boards there were warm under my knees, heat seeping up through my jeans as I knelt. Up close, the kitten's fur was a map of everything it had been through. The tawny patches looked dull and dirty, the black spots muddied with gray. Along its flank, snow had melted into cold little rivers that ran down and soaked into the towel. Its ears, with those ridiculous tiny tufts at the tips, were too cold to the touch, like 2 small stones left outside overnight. "Okay," I murmured, more to my hands than to the animal. "We don't have time for me to be scared." I grabbed the old digital thermometer I used to keep an eye on my own fevers, slid it gently against the kitten's body under the matted fur. The numbers climbed so slowly they might as well have been painted on. 91, 92, too low. No wonder its heart felt like a tired bird banging against a closed window. Heat first, always heat. I filled 2 glass bottles with hot water from the kettle, wrapped them in dish towels, and tucked them along the kitten's sides like warm bricks. Then I pulled one of Tom's wool sweaters from the back of a chair and draped it over all three of us, catching the smell of cedar and old aftershave as the knit fell around my shoulders. Lumen sat close enough that his breath touched my wrist, his fur steaming faintly as the stove heat chased the snow melt out of it. Every now and then he leaned forward and touched his nose to the kitten's ear, as if checking for some sign I couldn't see. My phone felt clumsy and slick in my hand as I scrolled to Priya's number. It rang longer than I liked before she answered, voice thick with sleep, and that flat tone only people used to bad news have. "Ellen, you all right?" "I'm fine," I lied, "but I've got a situation." I gave her the basics in clipped, practiced sentences. Approximate age, visible injury, temperature, responsiveness. I left out the part where my house cat had marched a bobcat through my front door like a delivery. "You know you're not supposed to keep a wild cat in your house," she said after a beat. I could hear rustling, the soft squeak of drawers, the familiar night sounds of someone pulling on clothes in the dark. State's strict about that, especially with predators. If Fish and Wildlife hears, "I'm not asking for permission," I cut in, more sharply than I meant to. "I'm asking how to keep it from dying in my living room." Silence, then a sigh. "All right. Heat like you're doing, small amounts of fluids, nothing by mouth yet if it's barely conscious. Clean that leg, if you can, gently. And Ellen, if it makes it through the night, we'll have to talk about the rest." We hung up with the promise of a morning visit. Morning felt like another lifetime away. I dampened a clean washcloth with warm, salty water and started on the wound. The smell of old blood and infection rose up, metallic and sour, cutting through the wood smoke and tea. Bits of dried fur and dirt clung stubbornly to the swollen flesh. The groove from the snare went all the way around the leg, a perfect angry ring. Whoever set that trap hadn't cared what it caught, only that something wouldn't get away. "Easy," I whispered, more to myself than to the kitten when it gave a faint twitch. "I know it hurts. I know." I'd said those words to strangers on gurneys, to drunk drivers and scared teenagers, and old men who smelled of loneliness and cigarettes. Saying them here, to this wild scrap of life, felt no different and completely different all at once. Hours blurred. The storm beat at the windows, changing pitch with the gusts, sometimes a low moan, sometimes a sharp rattle, like handfuls of gravel thrown against the glass. The clock in the kitchen ticked too loudly. My own back began to ache from hunching over, but I didn't dare move far. The kitten's breathing stayed shallow, ribs barely moving under the spotted fur. Every so often I checked its gums, pressing a fingertip gently to see how fast the color came back. Too slow, always too slow. Somewhere deep in the night, when the fire had burned down to a bed of red coals and the candle in front of Tom's picture was just a stub of wax, the rhythm changed. It started with a tiny jerk of one hind leg, then another. At first, I thought it was a dream my tired eyes were making up, but then the whole little body stiffened. The kitten's head snapped back, jaw clenched, and a harsh, ragged sound tore out of its throat. A sound that didn't sound like anything, just raw air forced past something that couldn't take any more. "No, no, no," I muttered, hands moving on their own, turning it gently so it wouldn't choke, keeping fingers away from snapping teeth. The muscles fluttered under my palms, hard and fast, then went rigid. Lumen, who had been dozing with his chin on his paws, bolted upright. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the pale green, until his eyes were almost black. He stepped over the towel, planting his big white paws on either side of the convulsing body, and drew in a long, shuddering breath, deeper than I'd ever seen a cat take. "Lumen," I warned, though I had no idea what I was warning him against. The storm howled against the cabin, the lights flickered once, and as the tiny body trembled on the edge of stopping for good, my house cat threw back his head and opened his mouth. What came out of Lumen didn't sound like any house cat I'd ever heard. It wasn't a meow or a hiss or even that low yowl they make when they see another Tom through the window. It started deep in his chest as a rough, rolling growl, then climbed into a long, throaty call that made the hair on my arms stand up. The sound filled the cabin, thick and wild, bouncing off the knotty pine walls. It had a raw edge to it, like wind forced through a canyon at midnight. There was something old in it, something that tasted like iron and wet leaves and all the things that live past the last porch light. The kitten's body was still locked stiff between my hands when that sound washed over us. Its paws were curled tight, claws pricking the towel, eyes squeezed shut. Lumen held the note, let it fall, then pulled another from somewhere I didn't know he had, shorter this time, almost like a question. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows in their frames, but in that moment all I could hear was Lumen and the thin rattle of the kitten's breath. Then, very slowly, the tension under my fingers began to melt. The little legs unclenched, the spine softened. The kitten's jaw relaxed just enough for a thin thread of air to slip out in a shaky exhale. Its eyelids fluttered, lashes sticking together, and one ear flicked weakly toward the sound. "There you go," I whispered, not sure who I was talking to. "That's it. Come back." Lumen lowered his head and made a different noise now, a low, steady rumble that vibrated against my wrists. It sounded almost like purring, but slower, deeper, like a motor idling in the dark. The kitten inched forward, dragging itself the barest bit until its forehead bumped against the thick fur of Lumen's chest. It pressed its nose there and stayed. I watched its breathing even out, from ragged, desperate pulls to something closer to a rhythm. The thermometer, when I tucked it back under the matted fur a few minutes later, crept up past 93, 94. It was the sort of change you'd miss if you weren't used to watching for it. I'd spent half my life counting heartbeats in windowless rooms, waiting for numbers on screens to move by single digits. This was the same work, just in different lighting. Lumen settled himself around the kitten like he'd rehearsed it. One big white paw draped over its back, tail curled in a loose half-moon so that if the little thing tried to roll away, it would bump into warmth on either side. His eyes drifted half-closed, but his ears stayed pricked, pointed toward the stove, the wind, my breathing. I eased back on my heels, every bone in my spine popping. The room smelled like wood smoke and wet fur and something sharp from the wound I'd cleaned. But under it all, there was a faint sweetness from the candle stub still burning by Tom's picture. The flame was low, the wax pooled, but it held. My mind wandered uninvited to another night of bad weather. Different storm, different house. Years ago, after a double shift in a flooded highway, I'd taken a shortcut past a condemned duplex down in the valley. The basement windows were black, half underwater, and there'd been a sound, thin, desperate, barely louder than the rain. I'd almost kept walking. Instead, I'd waded through ankle-deep water to pry the door open. Inside, up on a broken shelf, balanced above the rising brown tide, was a soaked, shivering chunk of white fur with eyes too big for its head. Lumen, long before he had a name, staring at me like I was the last dry patch of land on Earth. I'd wrapped him in my jacket, felt his heart battering my ribs through the damp fabric, and carried him home. I told myself then it was temporary, just until I found someone else to take him. We both knew better before the week was out, sitting there on the cabin floor, watching my old cat breathe slow and steady while this wild, spotted thing used him as both pillow and life raft. The circle of it settled over me like a weighted blanket. Once I had pulled Lumen out of the kind of cold that seeps into bone. Now he'd walked into a blizzard, found something even smaller than himself, caught in another kind of trap, and brought it to my door. Near dawn, when the storm had worn itself down to a tired whisper and the windows were fogged with our shared breath, my phone buzzed on the table. The sound was jarringly ordinary. It was Mark. "Morning," he said, voice rough with too little sleep. "Figured you'd be up. Sheriff called. Someone reported a sprung snare up on the north slope near your place. Blood, tracks, the whole mess. I'm heading out with her when the plows pass." I looked at the kitten, now tucked so deep into Lumen's fur it was almost just another patch of spots in a sea of white. "You don't say," I murmured. "What's that tone?" he asked. "You know something I don't?" I let my fingers rest lightly on the little rise and fall of its rib cage. "Just that whatever got out of that snare didn't get out on its own," I said. "And I think I know who did the heavy lifting." When I hung up, the sky outside had gone from pitch black to a soft, bruised blue, the kind of color the world gets just before the sun remembers it's supposed to come up. Lumen opened one eye, slit thin, and met my gaze. "Well," I told him quietly, "looks like you and I are back in the saving business." He shut his eye again, tightened his paw ever so slightly over the tiny bobcat pressed against him, and the three of us listened to the first snowplow grind its way up the mountain road. By the time the plows had scraped the road down to dirty ribbons of asphalt and Priya had come and gone with her vet bag and her warnings, the storm had shrunk to a steady, soft snowfall. The world outside my windows was all muted grays and whites, like someone had turned the color down on the whole mountain. Inside, though, there was a little cluster of warmth on the rug in front of the stove, Lumen's broad white body, and the small spotted shape tucked into the arc of his spine. The Bobcat Kitten slept hard for most of 2 days, waking only long enough to blink at the room with cloudy blue eyes and lap a few drops of watered-down broth from the edge of a spoon. Every time it stirred, Lumen adjusted himself around it like a living blanket. He let it knead his chest with tiny paws, tolerated clumsy claws snagging his fur without so much as a twitch. "You brought home work," I told him, easing myself down onto the floor beside them with a creak of old knees. "You know that, right?" He blinked once, slow and solemn, as if to say he knew exactly what he'd done. On the third morning, with pale sunlight finally pouring in across the floorboards, the kitten tried to stand. It wobbled up on all fours, the injured leg held stiff and awkward, and for a heartbeat I saw nothing but trouble in that little body. Strong shoulders, long toes, a spine built for leaping. Then its back end slipped, paws skidding on the wood, and it toppled sideways into Lumen's flank. A small, indignant sound puffed out of it. Not quite a hiss, not quite a mew, more like a complaint about the floor. Lumen answered with a low, reassuring purr and nudged it upright with his nose. The kitten shook itself, sending a fine spray of dust and loose fur into the stripe of sunlight, where it glittered like tiny gold sparks. It took 2 more unsteady steps, and then, as if the effort had been too much, simply sagged down and rested its chin on Lumen's tail. "Rust," I said, the word slipping out before I could think better of it. The reddish marks on its ears and along its back caught the light, the color of old iron. "You look like you rolled in a toolbox." The name fit. It felt right in my mouth, solid and simple. The kitten's ears twitched at the sound, and for the first time, I wondered if it would ever learn that noise meant it belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere wasn't exactly mine. That afternoon, Mark's pickup crunched up the drive, tires grinding on the packed snow. He stamped his boots on the porch and brought the cold in with him, along with the faint scent of gasoline and pine sap. His beard was full of ice crystals, and his cheeks were raw and red from the wind. "So this is your house guest," he said, squatting down to peer at Rust from a respectful distance. "Lord, Ellen, you don't start small, do you?" Rust regarded him with the grave suspicion only wild things and old men seem to manage, then tucked its head deeper under Lumen's chest. Lumen stared back at Mark, unblinking, as if considering whether this visitor needed to be filed under friend, foe, or furniture. Mark straightened with a grunt. "Fish and Wildlife found that snare," he said, "and 3 others like it, up past your north line. Wrong kind of cable, wrong placement, wrong everything. Wade Thompson's boot prints all over the place." I felt my jaw tighten. Wade had been skirting the edge of legal hunting for years, always just clean enough on paper to avoid a real charge. "Figures," I said. "He's never met a rule he didn't think was for somebody else." Mark nodded toward the rug. "This little guy is Exhibit A that his mess reaches farther than he thinks. But listen to me, Ellen. You patching it up in here? That's one thing. You starting to think of it like a pet? That's another." I bristled before I could stop myself. "I know what it is," I said. "I also know what happens if we just shove it back out there half dead because some line in a rule book says we should." His gaze softened a little. "I'm not the enemy," he said quietly. "But the law doesn't care that you gave half your life to other people's emergencies. To them, a bobcat in your living room is a bobcat in your living room." Rust chose that moment to stretch, tiny jaw cracking in a silent yawn. It pushed away from Lumen, testing its weight again, then turned toward the big front window. Outside, a snowplow groaned past, orange lights flashing, blades scraping sparks from the hidden gravel. The sound hit Rust like a physical blow. Its body went rigid, fur puffing out, ears flattened. It launched itself toward the glass with a speed that startled me, claws scrabbling on the wood, a low, raw growl tearing out of its throat. For a heartbeat, I saw the shape it would one day grow into, all muscle and instinct, slamming against whatever frightened it without a single thought about what stood in between. "Hey!" I shouted, heart lurching. I stepped fast, hands out, more afraid of it hurting itself than of it hurting me. Lumen moved first, though, a white streak across the floor. He planted himself between Rust and the window, bumping the kitten sideways with his shoulder, then pressed his forehead hard against Rust's. Eyes narrowed, purr roaring loud enough to feel in the soles of my feet. Rust trembled, claws still spread on the floorboards, then slowly sagged against him. The growl died into a rough little sigh. Mark let out the breath he'd been holding. "You see what I mean?" he said softly. "Cute as sin right now, scared as hell. But there's a lot of power in there, Ellen. If somebody else saw that, Linda with her chickens, Tyler with his badge, it'd go bad fast." I looked at Lumen, at Rust, at the way they'd folded back into each other like 2 pieces of a puzzle that shouldn't fit, and somehow did. My house felt suddenly like the step between 2 worlds, one paw on each side of a line I couldn't see, but sure as anything could feel. "I see it," I said. My voice surprised me with how tired it sounded. "I just don't know yet how to let one go without losing the other." Neither cat answered. They just stayed where they were, a white crescent and a spotted comma on my rug, breathing in the same warm patch of light while the cold blue afternoon pressed its face against the glass. It was almost easy to pretend the world had shrunk down to just the 3 of us. Days fell into a quiet rhythm. Feed the fire, change the bandage on Rust's leg, refill Lumen's bowl, talk to the cats like they were co-workers on a slow shift. Outside, the snow softened the truck noises on the highway until they sounded far away and harmless, like old memories. Then Carol Jenkins showed up with a pie and blew the walls off my little snow globe. I heard her. Before I saw her, boots clomping up the porch, the cheerful rattle of her knuckles on the door. Carol never knocked like she might not be welcome. She knocked like she assumed you'd be glad to see her, and she was usually right. "Ellen, you alive in there?" she called, voice bright as the bell on her diner. "Door!" I opened up to a rush of cold air and the smell of coffee and cinnamon. Carol stood there in her red parka, cheeks pink, a to-go box balanced in one hand, and her phone in the other like an extra limb. "Brought you the last slice of pecan before Hank could get his paws on it," she said, shouldering past me without waiting for an invitation. "Place feels strange without you yelling for refills." The cabin felt smaller with her in it, her energy bouncing off the quiet corners. She set the box on the table and spun in a little circle, eye-catching on the two shapes by the stove. "Well, look at you," she breathed. Lumen lay stretched out in his usual spot, fur shining milk white in the afternoon light. Rust was draped across his front legs, chin tucked into that thick mane, spots and faint stripes scattered like fallen leaves on snow. The bandage on his leg flashed clean white when he shifted. Carol's free hand flew to her chest. "Oh, my Lord, is that—" "Bobcat Kitten," I said, already hearing Priya's voice in my head. "Remember the law, remember the risk." "He was caught in a snare. Lumen brought him home. I'm just helping him get strong enough to make it out there." Carol stepped closer, breath fogging in a little halo between her and the rug. "You always did outdo the rest of us," she murmured. "I get strays at the diner, you get mountain royalty." Her phone was up before I could think to object. The screen glowed cold blue, reflecting in her eyes. "Don't," I started. "Oh, come on," she said, already tapping. "Just a little clip. Folks in town are half frozen and bored to death. This is better than cable." She crouched to find the angle, catching the way Rust's small, tufted ears twitched in his sleep, how Lumen's tail curled protectively around him. In the frame, it looked like a painting, white and gold and tawny, firelight turning their fur to liquid honey. "My house cat adopted a baby bobcat," she narrated in a soft, amazed tone. "Only in Silver Ridge, people." "Carol." My voice came out rough. "Don't use my name." She glanced up, eyebrows arched. "Fine, fine. Retired nurse in the mountains. Happy?" Before I could answer, she hit post. A little whoosh of digital sound, the kind that wouldn't mean much to anyone under 30. And there it was, out of my hands, and into a world I couldn't see from my window. By evening, my phone started buzzing. First, it was a text from one of the waitresses at the diner, a string of heart emojis, and, "Is this you?" Then Clara sent a screenshot from Facebook, the video already spinning up views, Carol's caption sitting above it like a headline. "You won't believe who this retired nurse is nursing now." The comments stacked up faster than I could read them. Some were pure sugar, angels among us. "Look at that big kitty taking care of the baby. Bless her heart." Some were edged. "Is that safe? What happens when it grows up? People are crazy." By the time the streetlights came on in town, the talk had spilled into the Silver Ridge Neighbors group. Someone had tagged Linda Moore. Under the shared video, she'd written, "If this is near my property, that thing better not come for my chickens." My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with clogged arteries. I set the phone down, palms slick, and stared at the two animals sleeping in front of my fire as if they might suddenly look dangerous to me too. An hour later, a new post popped up from an account I didn't recognize. No profile picture, just a gray silhouette. The photo attached was grainy and dark, but I knew what it showed, the twisted wire of a snare, half buried in snow, a smear of dried blood around it. The caption read, "Maybe if certain people weren't keeping wild predators in their homes, they wouldn't need traps in the first place." The comments exploded. Questions, accusations, defenses, jokes. Up here, The only sound was the soft crackle of another log catching in the stove and the slow, steady rhythm of two different heartbeats rising and falling in the same patch of light. For the first time since the storm, the cabin didn't feel like a refuge between worlds. It felt like the center of a circle I hadn't meant to draw, and the rest of Silver Ridge was already pressing up against the edges. They came on a morning so bright it almost felt rude. The sky was a hard, polished blue, the kind that makes every snowdrift blaze back at you, and the air had that brittle, glassy cold that bites your lungs if you breathe too deep. I heard them before I saw them, the low growl of an engine working its way up the hill, the crunch of tires on frozen gravel. Lumen heard it too. His ears flicked toward the door, tail giving one slow sweep along the rug. Rust lifted his head from Lumen's chest, pupils narrowing, listening. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and it wasn't from the temperature. A truck door slammed, then another. Voices, shapes moving past the frosted window. A sharp, nervous bark from down the drive, Linda's little cattle dog, high and shrill. Someone knocked, 3 hard raps that made the wood vibrate under my palm as I reached for the handle. When I opened the door, the cold shoved in past 3 silhouettes. Mark stood to one side, hat in his hands, expression wary. Beside him was a woman I recognized from town meetings. Solid build, dark hair pulled back under a green cap, the state crest on her jacket. The gold badge on her chest caught the light like a small sun. Behind them, half hidden by their shoulders, Linda peered in, wrapped in a plaid coat, jaw set, eyes already wet and angry. "Morning, Ms. Ward." The woman's voice was steady, not unkind. "I'm Officer Brooks. Tyler. We need to talk about the wildcat you've got in your home." Behind Linda, on the driveway, I glimpsed another car, and Carol leaning against it, phone already up, little red light winking. Tiny hearts and comments would be spilling up somebody's screen in town while my front door froze open. I stepped back, let the 3 of them in. The warmth rushed out to meet them, carrying the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and something sharp from the poultice on Rust's wound. Tyler's gaze went straight to the rug. Rust was half upright now, bandaged leg tucked in, Lumen's tail draped over his back like a shawl. The bobcat's ears pricked, but he didn't bolt. He just shaded, pale eyes bright against the pattern of his fur. "That," Linda said, stabbing a finger toward him, "is what's going to tear up every chicken I've got if we don't do something." "Linda," Mark said quietly. "No," she snapped. "I'm not the crazy one here. She's got a predator in her living room like it's some kind of Hallmark movie. And we're all supposed to clap?" I felt my heart kick once, hard, like it wanted to run ahead of me. "He was in a snare on my property," I said, surprised at how even my voice came out. "Half dead. My house cat brought him in. I did what I've always done, Linda. I kept something from dying on my floor." Tyler lifted a gloved hand, palm out. "Nobody's questioning your intent, ma'am, but the law's clear. Bobcats are wild game. Keeping one in your home, even temporarily, puts you and everyone else on thin ice." Rust let out a low sound then, not quite a growl, more like a warning in a language we'd all forgotten. Lumen responded with a rumble of his own, deeper than usual, his body shifting just enough that he was now between Rust and the people in my doorway. "Look at him," Linda said. "He's already sizing us up." "He's scared," I said. I could feel my blood rising, a slow heat under my ribs. "So are you, so am I. Difference is, he doesn't get to choose where he was born." Mark cleared his throat. "Tyler, you saw the snares," he said. "You saw how close they were to her line. That cat didn't climb in her window. It got dragged into this mess, same as she did." Tyler's eyes stayed on Rust. Up close, you could see the details. The tufted ears, the faint black streaks running from the eyes, the deep reddish patches along the back. Not a pet, no matter how sweet the picture looked in the video. "I saw them," she said, "and I've got Wade Thompson's footprints in my file. That's a separate investigation. What we're dealing with here is risk. To livestock, to people, to you, Ms. Ward." "I've been living with risk since I was 22 years old," I said softly. "This is just the first one with whiskers and spots." For a moment, nobody said anything. The only sounds were the ticking of the stove, the faint hum of Carol's car engine outside, and the slow, steady purr coming from Lumen's chest, as steady as a drum. Then Rust moved. He rose to his feet, all four this time, favoring the bad leg, but holding his head high. He stepped out from the shelter of white fur and onto the edge of the rug, the line where soft wool met cold, bare floorboard. The winter light from the window poured over him, catching every fleck of color in his coat, turning his whiskers to fine silver wires. He looked at Tyler first. Not a challenge, not a threat, just a direct, searching stare, as if memorizing her face. Then he turned that same gaze on Linda. Her breath hitched. I saw the pulse jump in her throat. When his eyes found mine, something inside my chest loosened and tightened at the same time. Lumen stepped up behind him, close enough that their fur brushed. They stood together at that invisible border, the place where my world met theirs, and the room felt suddenly crowded with things bigger than laws or fears. Tyler shifted her weight, boots creaking on the floor. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its crisp edges. "Legally," she said, "this animal belongs out there." She nodded toward the window, where the blue shadows of the pines lay long and cold across the snow. Out of houses, off social media, away from chicken coops. I opened my mouth, but she held up a hand again. "But," she went on, "I'm also not blind. It didn't get that bandage from a poacher, and it didn't carry itself through your door. I can't write a report that fits all of that into a box, and I'm not sure I want to try." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded form, then pushed it back without looking at it. "Here's what I'm willing to do," she said. "We treat him as what he is, a wild guest. You work with Mark and with Priya to get him strong enough to make it on his own. You don't parade him around town. No more videos, no more surprise visits. And when the time comes, you help him go. You don't keep him here because it fills a hole." The words landed like a slow, heavy blow. I felt each one. "And if I don't?" I asked quietly. "Then the state comes up here with a tranquilizer gun and takes him on our terms, not his," she said. "And I don't think either of us wants to watch that." Linda let out a sharp breath, but she didn't argue. Maybe even she understood there was something fragile hanging between us that shouting would only shatter. I looked at Rust, standing so still, the only movement was the slight flare of his nostrils, the tiny flick of his ear when Lumen's whiskers brushed it. I thought of the snare, of the way his body had jerked under my hands, of Lumen's wild, impossible call. I thought of the nights I'd spent in trauma bays, knowing when it was time to fight and when it was time to let go. "All right," I said. My voice sounded older than I felt. "We'll do it your way, his way, if we can." Tyler nodded once, sharp, as if sealing a deal. Mark's shoulders dropped a fraction. Linda shook her head, muttering something under her breath, but when she met my eyes, there was more. Fear than anger there. They filed back out into the bright cold, boots thudding on the porch, voices muffled as the door swung shut behind them. The cabin settled around me again, but it didn't feel the same. There was a line drawn now, clear as the one between rug and floor, and I was standing on it. Russ turned, limped back to the warm circle by the stove, and folded himself against Lumen with a small sigh. I sat down beside them, the old floor pressing up through my bones, and laid my hand gently over both their backs. "Looks like we've got a deadline, boys," I said. "Let's not waste what time we've been given." Outside, somewhere beyond the glass, a crow called once, its voice harsh and black against the blue afternoon, and the mountain held its breath with us. Teaching Russ to leave was harder than teaching anyone to stay. Mark and I started small. He helped me rig a low platform at the tree line behind the cabin, a rough table of old boards where we set out scraps of venison and chicken, away from the porch, away from Linda's fence. I opened the back door in the evenings and stood in the cold long enough for my fingers to ache, letting the smells of the woods drift in. Rust would pad to the threshold and stop, paws sinking into the drift just outside. The air out there was sharper, full of pine and cold stone, and the faint iron scent of things that hunted and things that died. His whiskers quivered as he tasted it. Sometimes he'd step into it, shoulder to shoulder with Lumen, and stand until his fur frosted over, then turn and come back in to curl up by the stove like it had all been a bad idea. At night, Mark's trail camera sent back grainy, green-tinted clips from the dark. A big bobcat moving like a shadow between the trees, tail short and thick, ears tipped with black. Once, in the ghostly light, we saw the same reddish smudges along her back that Rust wore. "Mother," Mark said quietly, tapping the screen. "She's hanging around, waiting or looking." I started playing audio from his camera in the evenings too, a low series of yowls and chirps that rolled through the cabin like the sound of a violin played in another room. The first time I hit play, Rust froze, every muscle focused, ears locked toward the speaker. His mouth opened slightly, breathing in the sound. "Go on," I whispered. "That's your real language, not mine." He didn't go, not that night or the next. But each sunset he crept a little farther down the back steps, left his paw prints a little deeper into the untouched snow. Lumen always went with him, big white shadow, walking slow so Rust could keep up on the bad leg. And then one cold, pale morning, I woke to find only one set of prints coming back to the porch. Lumen lay alone by the stove, tail curled neatly around himself, eyes on the door, like he understood something I didn't want to say out loud. "Well," I told him, voice thin in the empty kitchen, "we did. Promise." The house settled into a different kind of quiet after that. I still put a dish out at the tree line. Habit, hope, who knows? And sometimes the snow around it was marked with round paw prints by morning. But Rust's spot on the rug stayed empty. Spring came, then summer, then another fall that smelled of dry leaves and chimney smoke. My own heart had its moods. Some days a steady drum, some days a fluttering pigeon in a too-small cage. Priya adjusted my meds. Clara nagged me about coming down the mountain more. I promised both of them I was being careful, which was true in the way people tell the truth when they're not willing to move. The night it happened, the sirens came back before I ever heard them. The storm had rolled in fast, black clouds swallowing the stars, snow coming down in tight, stinging sheets. The power blinked once, then failed, leaving the cabin full of soft, smothering dark. I'd just set a kettle on the wood stove when a sharp pain squeezed my chest, hot and deep, radiating down my left arm like someone had poured fire into my veins. I knew that feeling. I knew it too well. My fingers went numb on the edge of the counter. The room tilted, then slid sideways. The last thing I saw before the floor rushed up was Lumen, eyes wide, his white fur flashing in a lightning flare from the window. Later, they showed me the footage. Mark had installed a simple camera under the eave months before, just in case. In the grainy, snow-streaked image, the porch is a small island of shadow and light. Wind shoves the snow sideways in thick white bands. Then a shape materializes out of it, a low, powerful body, fur dark against the drift. Rust grown into the promise of his frame, shoulders rolling, tail a short, solid bar. The wooden collar I'd carved long ago still hangs around his neck, darker now, scarred and worn. He comes straight to the door, sniffs, then throws his weight against it, claws scraping loud enough to wake the dead on the other side of the wall. When the door doesn't move, he circles the cabin, leaping up to slam his paws against the windows, his mouth open in silent shouts the camera can't record. He doesn't give up. He bounds off the porch and heads for the next patch of light, the glow from Linda's kitchen. He plants himself in her yard and lets loose a sound that cuts right through double-pane glass and closed curtains, a ragged, wild cry that sent her little dog into a frenzy. Linda later told me she thought the world was ending. She saw Rust at the window, teeth bared, eyes burning gold in the porch light, and did the only thing she could think to do. She called 911 and shouted something about a bobcat gone crazy at the neighbors. By the time the paramedics and Tyler's truck ground their way up the hill, the storm had turned the road into a white tunnel. They found me on the kitchen floor, face gray, pulse irregular but hanging on. Lumen was pressed against my side, eyes huge, his fur damp from pacing. Rust was gone from the porch by then. What stayed was the imprint of his paws in the snow, clear as fingerprints. When I woke in the hospital, the lights were too bright. The air smelled like antiseptic and plastic and the faint sweetness of canned peaches. Clara was there. So were Mark and Priya. Someone had propped a tablet on the rolling table so I could watch the clip. "That's what tipped us off," Clara said, voice thick. "We would have lost 10-15 minutes if not for that call." And she wouldn't have made that call if he hadn't scared the daylights out of her. On the screen, my bobcat, no, not mine, not really, threw himself against my door like a living battering ram, urgency in every line of his body. "Guess he figured it was his turn," Mark said softly. Silver Ridge talked about it for months. The video went everywhere, local news, national stations, shows with shiny-haired hosts smiling over mugs. "My house cat dragged home a tiny bobcat kitten," the headline said. Years later, that bobcat came back and dragged help to her door. People said they were stunned. Angels, miracles, fate. Wade Thompson got his fine and lost his license to hunt for good. Linda started putting out a dish of water on her own porch, just in case. Life didn't turn into a movie after that. It never does. I went home with more pills, more rules, more follow-up appointments. Lumen grew slower, his jumps lower, his naps longer. One soft autumn afternoon, with the aspens outside the window rattling their gold coins in the wind, he laid his head on my knee, sighed once, and didn't pick it up again. I buried him under the pines behind the cabin where the snow falls thick and quiet. I carved a little wooden marker with his name and a simple line, "The one who brought him home." Winter came back around like it always does. I lit my candle in front of Tom's picture, listened to the wind, took my pills. Some nights, the cabin felt too big. Some nights, it felt exactly the size it needed to be. Every now and then, on a blue, breathless evening, when the snow was falling straight down and the world held still, I'd catch movement at the edge of the yard. A shape just outside the circle of porch light. Tufted ears. A low, sure walk. Once I saw a smaller shadow with it, trotting close at its side. They never came to the door. They didn't need to. They'd stand there a while, just long enough for my tired eyes to be sure. And then they'd melt back into the trees, leaving only prints that the next storm would quietly erase. The sirens are mostly for other people now. I hear them faintly sometimes, drifting up from town on clear nights. But every winter, something else comes to my door. No lights, no beeping, just the memory of paws on wood and a wild heart that once answered a house cat's call and later, somehow, heard mine. What we save doesn't always stay. It grows up, it walks away, it finds its own ridge to stand on. But if we were brave enough to love it while we had it, it has a way of circling back, year after year, just close enough to remind us that we were never as alone as we thought. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.